Hi, I'm Tao, an artist and writer, and today I'll be doing something quite different from what I usually do, in that I will be talking about military history, mostly, in the format of kind of an experimental lecture. So, ever since I was a child, I was quite interested in history, and especially in military history. And I think that's perhaps not so surprising since war and war making seems to be one of our favorite imaginaries. All of our films, all of our fantasy worlds are populated with images of war and of battle. So, the title of the lecture is 4,000 Years of War, from Lagash to the Fiber Optic Front. Humans evolved a couple of key traits that empowered us, apart from our intellect, our language, our extraordinary capability to transmit heat out of our bodies into the surroundings via sweat. Apart from these things, the specific layout of our bodies enabled a whole new motion, that of throwing. This ability to inflict injury or death beyond the immediate confines of our body is unique. This true ranged capability is unique to humans among all animals. In this lecture, I will trace certain lines of flight from this earliest sharpened stick thrown with hope, perhaps even something akin to love or desire, at some ancient ungulate. From there to this technology's apogee in the intercontinental ballistic missile. I'll start with a quote, which is quite famous. It's even somewhat of a meme now, but it kind of structurates my thinking about this topic. "It makes no difference what men think of war," said the judge. "War endures. As well ask men what they think of stone. War was always here. Before man was, war waited for him. The ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. That is the way it was and will be. That way and not some other way." So I want to talk a little bit first about kind of the development of these weapon technologies, the earliest of which I would argue is the spear. So the spear is a composite tool. So one of the parameters we use to distinguish modern Homo sapiens sapiens from just Homo sapiens is composite tool use, meaning it's not just a stone, it's not just a piece of wood, it is a stone put together with a piece of wood. And the spear is perhaps one of the most ubiquitous technological developments humans have ever made. Spears have been used from very early prehistoric times up until around the 19th century. They've perhaps been the most common battlefield weapon everywhere on Earth throughout almost all of human history. But very early, there's the distinguishment between a hunting implement and a weapon is a lot more blurry because humans are not just at war with each other, but their relationship to nature is not just one of predator, but also of prey. Before humans organized in large-scale societies, animals were also hunting us. So these weapons were not only used offensively, but also defensively. The next kind of iteration of this technology is the bow. And the bow is really interesting because when humans spread from our cradle in Africa into all corners of the world, we hadn't actually invented the bow yet. Yet the bow seems to have been invented by every single human group in the world. This is an example of what's called convergent evolution. An analogy in biology would be something like the wing, which fish have wings, not a lot of them, but flying fish. Insects have wings, birds have wings. Few mammals have wings, like flying squirrels. Reptiles also have wings. So the bow is kind of the same, that it seems to be something that every human group will invent at some point. Not all human groups use it. For example, the people who live far, far north don't use it very much. They use mostly javelins and harpoons, but they know about the bow. And I always liked that so much, the idea of how the bow was invented, because I think it's something that almost exists in nature itself. Like, I think all of us have experienced this feeling of you're sitting as a kid and you're just plucking at a piece of wood, at a little branch, and if you peel off the bark of a tiny twig, and then the bark is still attached at one end, and then you tie it around the other end, you have already made a mini bow. Like, this principle of kinetic force being able to be stored in something via elastic compression is so easy to discover. You just sit with a piece of wood, and the principle is kind of demonstrated to you by nature. I always liked this idea that the invention of the stringed instrument immediately preceded the invention of the bow. That the first thing this ancient forebear of ours would have done would be to plink with it and say, it makes sound. And then right after be, okay, it can launch things. And I think, to me, in kind of a poetic or magical thinking, there's a certain tragedy to that, because what we then do is, when we've invented the bow, we want to invent the arrow. And if any of you have ever tried to make a shitty little bow when you were kids, the arrow will not fly very far. And part of the reason is that it's not stabilized. And to stabilize it, you need to put what's called vanes, which are the feathers at the back of a bow. And again, here in this kind of magical thinking, which I think empirically for these people who lived very early in history and didn't have a lot of knowledge of technology or of writing, the idea of looking at a bird and seeing, the bird flies, and if I take part of the bird and put it on the arrow, maybe the arrow will fly. Like, the kind of empirical thinking of that is quite sound. And I always thought that was such a kind of perfect, tragic image, this idea that we took the gift of flight and imbued it and created this far-sending death. And what could have gone different for us if the first thing we managed to make fly had not been one of killing? So, from there, I'll begin to talk about human civilizations. And I just want to make a note here that civilization is a very fraught term. It's been used to justify colonialism and genocide in the last kind of 200 years. I will be using it in the kind of very strict archaeological sense, where it denotes certain symptoms that human societies develop. These are agriculture, urbanization, social hierarchy, organized religion, monumental architecture, and warfare. And civilization, as human societies that follow this kind of recipe, develops also independently 6 different places on Earth. So it's Sumer, which is roughly in southern Iraq, Egypt, in the Indus Valley in India, in China, in Mesoamerica, and in the Andes Mountains. And what's again interesting is that they all follow roughly the same blueprint. There seems to be some things that are just kind of incipient to when humans start coalescing into larger groups. There's these things we just kind of start doing. And there's a piece of literature called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Maybe some of you know about it. It is the earliest kind of long-form epic literature we have. It's around 5,000 years old. And I find it very interesting that there seems to be a kind of awareness of or a reflection on this fall of innocence. We have it also in the Bible with Adam and Eve eating from the apple of knowledge and kind of losing this innocence of animals when they become exposed to civilization, I suppose. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, this is reflected in the character of Enkidu. So, a brief preface, Gilgamesh is this kind of god king, and he's a huge asshole. He's like having sex with all the women and bullying all the men, and everyone hates him. So the people, and he's the best at everything, right? So the people of Uruk, which is kind of the first city, go to the gods and they say, hey, you got to do something about this guy. So the gods answer their petition and they create Enkidu. But where Gilgamesh is born of the city, Enkidu is born of nature. So Enkidu has hair all over his body, and he drinks from the river, and he is raised by the gazelles and the wolves. And when Gilgamesh finds out about this, he realizes, oh, there's someone as powerful as me, so I have to get him on my side. So what he does is he finds a harlot, and he sends her, and she brings with her beer and bread. And so she sits on the other side of the river, and Enkidu comes to her, and then she gives him beer and bread. And then she's got him, because he's never tasted that before. He's been eating grass. And as soon as he eats these things of civilization, he kind of becomes totally convinced and leaves behind the natural world, and now the gazelles fear him. They don't want to be his friend anymore. And I find this whole aspect of the story very interesting, because I think it reflects an awareness of the changes of human condition and of human consciousness that happen when we begin to live in urbanized societies. And this is especially, I would say, would have been very prevalent in this era of human history, because the people living in these ancient cities 5,000 years ago, they would have been meeting with and trading with people who lived in kind of prehistoric, like Neolithic technological conditions. So people who would kind of live in the eyes of civilized man much closer to the animal condition. And even people who would speak the same language as them. Like imagine going and meeting a caveman, but you speak roughly the same language. So they would have been very aware of this kind of divide in the nature of man, and that there was a certain kind of tragedy to that development. The title of the lecture, I say from Lagash, and Lagash was one of these early city-states. So when we have civilization, the most common form of organization are these city-states that are walled enclosures and that have large-scale kind of agriculture to support them. And from Lagash, we have this artifact, which is called the Stele of Vultures. So stele is kind of a rock tablet with images on it. And the Stele of Vultures depicts on one side an army, men with shields and spears standing in close formation, and their king walking ahead of them. And on the other side, vultures picking apart the dead bodies of their enemies. And it is kind of, I would say, the earliest depiction or the earliest art showing large-scale warfare. And I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between art and war in the ancient world. Some of you might have seen I find really beautiful monumental palace art of the Assyrians. It's these raised reliefs. A lot of them are from Nineveh, which was one of the palace cities. And a lot of them depict these horrifying things, people being scalped, people being tortured, people being held in subjugation. And so when you're going to meet the king of the Assyrians, what you're seeing is all these different images of him defeating and humiliating his enemies. So it's kind of a tool of state propaganda. But I mean, I kind of have the image of, imagine if you're going into the Oval Office and what America is showing are all the images of the people that they're torturing and killing. Would have been unthinkable 10 years ago, maybe not so much anymore. Okay. I would like to talk a little bit about these kind of systems of systems, and I think that the best way for me to do that is I want to talk a little bit about what's called the Bronze Age collapse. So we're skipping forward about 2,000 years now. So the Bronze Age collapse happens around 1100 BC, and the situation there is kind of remarkably similar to geopolitical modes of organization that we can recognize today. So the extent of the world is not the whole planet, it's just the kind of Eastern Mediterranean, but we have a system where there are around 7 kind of large-scale powers that are all sometimes engaging in warfare, but mostly they're trading with each other. So it's a kind of highly international, multipolar system. And one of the prime commodities, no surprising being that it's called the Bronze Age, is of course bronze. And bronze is made of about 9 parts copper and 1 part tin. And copper was relatively easy to get. There's many different places you can mine it. But tin is really rare. I think you can mine it in Afghanistan, a few other places in Western Asia. But we actually have evidence that they went all the way to Wales to mine it 3,000 years ago. So that just kind of shows the scale of this kind of trade and pseudo-industrialist organization that was going on back then. What's interesting about these societies is that they're highly centralized. So power is highly centralized, and all of the kind of core functions of the state, like the army and food production, are also highly centralized. In order to sustain intensive agriculture, you need irrigation. So you need a lot of water, and the only way to get that is to dig irrigation trenches. So you need a large labor pool that's kind of continually working. Okay, so we have this system. Then the last kind of part of it is the chariot. So the chariot is a military technology that's brought possibly from the Hittites, but adopted by the Egyptians. And in this age, it was extremely effective. It was kind of like the jet fighter of the age. So it was really, really hard to make them, really, really expensive, a lot of maintenance, a lot of training, a very, very resource-intensive weapon system, but also something that almost couldn't be touched by people who didn't have access to it. The same way that you can't really interact with a fighter jet if you just have like small arm weapons. It would have been really difficult for people who just had spears and bows to interact with chariots. Part of this is because cavalry, like people riding on horses, was not very effective yet, mostly because horses would have been scary and most people didn't really know about them, like the knowledge of how to interact with horses. Also, the breeds of horses were probably different. Like if you think about the dog in relation to the wolf, how much that has changed. The horse is also an animal where we bred for certain behavioral traits, right? In addition to that, we hadn't invented yet the stirrup or the saddle. So fighting on horseback, you would have to be extremely trained, and it seems likely that the way horses were used in war was just for transportation. So you would ride to the place where you would fight, and then you would dismount and fight like that. So these chariots were extremely effective because they allowed people to ride up close to you, shoot powerful arrows from composite bows, and then ride away again, all while kind of having a little bit of cover and a lot of safety. So what happens? Why do we have this thing called the Bronze Age collapse? Well, it's actually precipitated by a climate catastrophe. So there's a volcano eruption around 1100 BC. I can't remember whether it's in Iceland or Sicily, but anyway, a lot of ash is propelled into the atmosphere in these areas of the world. And this means that these kind of quite already fragile agricultural systems, because you're really using the land intensely, and you're also beginning to have like monoculture crops where you're only growing one thing. So you don't have a lot of leeway and a lot of resilience if your agricultural system begins to fail. Then suddenly, because you also have a population boom, then suddenly you have a situation where half of the people don't have enough food. And this, of course, leads to massive destabilization of social and state systems and to mass migration. So during a very short period of time, 5 out of these 7 states in the Eastern Mediterranean collapse, like completely disappear off of the face of the earth. The only 2 that really survive are Assyria, which retreats to its heartland in Iraq, and which used to be kind of all the way in the Levant in Turkey, and Egypt. But in both of these places, we almost see writing disappear for 100 years. Like imagine how pivotal of an event you have to have happen for writing to disappear. And I think a part of this is that these systems, I see them as undergoing a kind of crystallization. And so they become really brittle. What I mean by that is if you have a magistrate who goes and pays the workers to dig the irrigation canals and then goes and organizes the transport of grain, and then he finds out that there's this wave of enemy warriors coming and he flees, well, then this one person causes this whole system to collapse because it's not like self-organized, it's not a flat hierarchy. So in that way, when you go from, for example, really early hunter-farmer or like low-scale persistence farming societies to these centralized, highly organized societies, you also become kind of brittle to shock. And I always find that as kind of a good lesson, because we're now in a situation where it's not unimaginable that these systems of systems that we're building could also be vulnerable to different kinds of shock. For example, large-scale climate change. It's really interesting when you read the kind of reports of the people of this time, because it reads like apocalypse fiction. And the aliens in these fiction are people known as the Sea People. And this mysterious name, I think, has entertained the minds of scholars for a long time. Because they kind of seem like aliens. They come from nowhere and they just destroy everything. What seems the most likely is that they're actually a kind of confederation of refugees from the kind of western part of the world. The extent of the world would go to about kind of Italy, Spain, and that there are people from these areas who are gathering together into larger and larger groups, fleeing this climate collapse, trying to find a place to live. One of the things that's enabling this migration, or not the migration, but their military success against these states, is also iron. Because compared to bronze, iron is really, really cheap. So it's kind of like the invention of the AK-47, which allowed a lot of rebel groups in different parts of the world to fight against kind of technologically superior enemies. Iron is kind of, it's a similar mechanism at play here, where bronze you could really only have, if you had a Levi warrior, maybe his spear tip could be bronze, but there's no way he could have bronze armor. But when you have iron, you start to have that, it becomes a lot cheaper to equip people quite properly. Okay, so that's a bit about kind of systems of systems and system shock and the kind of value in disorganization. Another time where these imperial powers are disturbed by what they perceive as a lesser people are the waves of steppe nomads that continually incur both east and west. So around 0 BC, we have two really large empires that last for a very long time. We have, well, I guess about 100 AD. But we have the Han Chinese in the east and the Romans in the west. And they're kind of so far away from each other that they never really had contact, but they know about each other, that there is a large empire kind of way on the other side of the world. And between them, there's this whole stretch of land, which is the Eurasian steppe. And what's interesting about this area is that people have always lived there, and people have, since very early in history, used horses to a very large degree. In fact, archaeologists have discovered a settlement in, I think it's Serbia, which pushes back the date for what we could call a city by about 3,000 years. I think it's something like 7,000 BC. They had a place with maybe 50,000 people living in it that then completely disappears because the horse people come, and the horse people fuck up your shit. And this is kind of something that just happens throughout history. It happens with Attila for the Romans, it happens with the Xinye in China, it happens with the Scythians for the Romans and the Greeks, and it happens more than anything with the Mongolians and with Genghis Khan, who conquers China and who conquers much of the Islamic world and kind of destroys the Library of Baghdad, which is maybe one of the greatest losses of humankind, because I think it's likely that we would have been on the moon by 1750 or something if this library hadn't been lost, because so much knowledge was stored there. But the reason that they could do this was because they could employ maneuver warfare, fluid command structures, and kind of a different organization of society led to a different organization of military that could move in a way that was completely incomprehensible to settled societies. When the Greeks fought the Scythians, I think they had this problem that they kept being invaded and attacked, and then they said, okay, then we go invade your capital. And then the Scythians were just like, okay, we'll just leave. I mean, it's just buildings, we'll just take all our stuff with us. And to the settled mind, this kind of disorganized way of living or not being sedentary as one place is kind of really, really hard to deal with. I want to talk a little bit about disorganization in a completely different era, because there's this writer I was interested in for a while called Eyal Weizman. He also does stuff with forensic architecture, and I think was also for some time employed here in Vienna. And he has a great text called Walking Through Walls, which is about how it's from 2007, I think, so it predates the genocide, or this part of the genocide. But it's about how the IDF is employing French kind of really abstract theory like Deleuze and Guattari to think about urban spaces and to kind of have a different philosophical understanding of how you employ space. So the basic thesis of it is that is an inversion of urban space. So what these guys at this military academy is trying to instill in the mind of the IDF soldier is that the street is not an open space. The street is a closed space, because if you walk in the street, you're going to get shot. The door is not an open space. The door is a closed space, because if you walk through the door, you're going to get shot. The window is not an open space, because if you look through the window, there's a gun waiting behind it. And the inversion then curtails the wall is an open space. So the way we move that way is we just blow holes through the walls of these families' houses, and then we move through the walls in that way. And I found that really interesting. And he's also talking about, instead of thinking of ourselves as an army, we think of ourselves as gangs or insects that are kind of like operating like swarms. So having really fluid command structures, not necessarily having this hierarchy where information needs to travel up and down, but being able to be very reactive. Kind of like how a school of fish will move away from where the shark is and always go to its side, to kind of operate in this way of a swarm. And I found that really interesting. I'll read a short quote. A state military whose enemy is scattered as a network of sporadic gangs must liberate itself from the old concept of straight lines, linear formations of units, regiments, and battalions, and become itself much more diffused and scattered, flexible, and swarm-like. In fact, it must adjust itself to the stealthy capability of the enemy. Swarming, to my understanding, is simultaneous arrival to target from a large number of nodes, if possible, from 360 degrees. And another quote which I really liked, which is just the sentence, the reorganization of the urban syntax by a series of micro-tactical actions. From that, I want to talk a little bit about the scale of warfare, because I think one of the teleologies of history, and especially of warfare, is one of kind of linear development, that it keeps getting better and better and larger, which is also to some degree true. But one of the things that challenges this is, for example, European history, because European military history is happening in such an unbelievably small scale, which I always found kind of funny. So you have the famous wars between the French and the English, and the battles are something like 40,000 people are participating at the same time. And then you go back 1,500 years to imperial Chinese history, and then you have battles where it's like 700,000 people are dying on a single day. So this European really important war would have been like a border skirmish. You probably they wouldn't even have written it down. And in kind of our part of the world, which I'm thinking of like the Eastern Mediterranean through Central Europe, or like Europe up until the Rhine, at least, kind of the Roman world, there's actually just a downward trend until very, very late at history. There was one military podcast guy I liked who had this example of what happens if you take Alexander the Great's Macedonian army and you put it in Waterloo, so Napoleon's final battle. And it's kind of interesting because, well, they have guns and cannons and they have all these things, but the organization and the numbers and these things meant that an army from almost exactly 2,000 years earlier would possibly have performed kind of okay, even at Waterloo. because they were still using cavalry, and cavalry was still effective, and cavalry is just men on horses with armor and blades, and the Macedonians also had really good cavalry. So it isn't until the time of about Napoleon where the armies also reached the same kind of sizes as you saw in the ancient world. So after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, armies in general are just really, really small in the kind of whole European world. And I think a part of the reason for this is the efficacy of cavalry, that when you have very effective cavalry, it's possible that it becomes so hard to control a very large swath of territory when a small group of warriors can move quickly and raid and steal and so on. It's hard to project a feeling of safety to a really large area when you have these technologies. So I mean, if you look at a map of Germany before unification, it looks like a camouflage pattern, right? It's like 1,000 little baronies and duchies, and I think a part of the reason for that, for this political organization, is a reaction to shifts in military technology. So like politics are also reacting and being shaped by these things. I want to talk a little bit about scale again, because Napoleon is where it really changes. He has this idea of the Grande Armée. So before that, European armies were professional and were extremely small, like a couple of 10,000 people or just a couple of thousand people for a relatively large state. And with the Grande Armée, he has this kind of, which is not really a new idea, and which is, I think the political history of that is too complicated to go into now. I also don't know so much about it. But armies increase drastically in size. From there, we get to the First World War, which is kind of the beginning of the true tragedy at scale of warfare, where millions, hundreds of thousands of lives are thrown for nothing. I mean, you can say something about the horrors of war, but at least from the perspective of the Romans, even if they were genociding people, they seemed to be gaining something from it. They were getting wealth and they were conquering things. And in World War I, there's not even anyone gaining from it. It's just this complete waste of human life. You have hundreds of thousands of people dying for conquering like 1 square kilometer. It's also the first time where this will be like kind of the last portion of the lecture that I'm aiming towards now, which is, I think it's the first time that the scale of warfare begins to really change the earth. Like you can still see the line of the front because of the intensity of artillery barrage. It's also the first time where the landscape was really turned into something completely different, where the scale of warfare meant that the birds were not singing, the insects couldn't survive, all vegetation disappeared from these areas. So we really created kind of a wasteland or hellscape that these soldiers had to endure. It's also the first time that people have to be in a war situation for such a long time. Historically, battles lasted for an afternoon, right? Then it got dark, then everyone went home. But in World War I, you have people living inside of kind of a combat situation for many days or even months. And we also see kind of the human organism, this monkey that learned to throw a spear such a long time ago, it can't handle this. So many people go crazy. We begin to have an understanding of PTSD, which we called shell shock back then, to the kind of psychological impact of being in these war situations. But what I was really interested in was also just the scale of it, like the hundreds of thousands of shells, the millions of tons of material, food, bullets, clothing, and so on that need to be thrown into this endeavor in order to just not lose. And I think today we're at a point where the scale has reached a truly planetary magnitude. If you take the US military complex and you rank it as a country, it would be the 25th largest emitter of CO2 gas. So it would be larger than some pretty large countries, just the military. The US military is also the first planetary or global force. No other military in the history of empires has ever been able to have vision over every part of the world and to have the logistical and strike capability to influence things on the whole of our planet. The second part of the title of the lecture was this idea of the fiber optic front. By fiber optic, I mean these fiber optic cables that both shape how information traverses the world. A lot of internet traffic runs along these fiber optic cables. But also in Ukraine, there's been this new development. So as you probably know, there's a lot of drone warfare in Ukraine. There's two kind of primary types of drones. There's loitering drones that hover above you and then they drop a bomb. And then there are kamikaze drones which fly really fast, like an angry bee in your face and then explode. And we have humans, puny little monkeys with guns, have no defense against these. So the only way to protect yourself is to have a jammer, something that sends out signals, the same kind of frequency of electromagnetic waves as those that the drones use to communicate with their controller. So this can mean that they kind of lose signal when they're maybe half a kilometer or 100 meters away from you, and this is your only safety. And so, of course, the reaction to that is a development, a technological development by the Ukrainians, which is that instead of having a wireless connection, they just have a wire going directly from the person controlling it to the drone. It's really thin, looks like a fishing wire. And they come on these spools that are now like 50 kilometers long. The reason I find this interesting, and the reason that I use this as the kind of last part of the title, is because I saw a great image. I wish I had a projector so I could show it here, but it shows a field somewhere in the front of Ukraine at sunset. And you can see these thousands and thousands of fiber optic wires that are littering the landscape. And it looks like everything is covered in spider webs, basically. And I found that to be such an interesting and also horrifying image, because these things do not degrade quickly in nature. So these parts of nature will be entangled by, I mean, it's essentially glass, will be entangled by these long, thin lines of glass for potentially hundreds of years. From there, I want to talk about what I believe to be the kind of apogee of weapons development. So I want us to think back for a moment at this first human who made and threw a spear, and how terrifying it must have been for other human groups who encountered someone who had spears if they themselves did not. And then I want us to think a little bit about nuclear weapons. We've had nuclear weapons now for, 70, 80 years or something? And we have employed them against our fellow man twice on a large scale, killing tens of thousands of people. And I can't help but get a bit poetic about this idea of nuclear weapons, because they operate on the same physical principles as the sun. And I can't help but taking one of our forefathers from 50,000 years ago and dragging him along to the desert in the US in the 50s to one of these Trinity tests and showing him. And what would he say except that we had clearly harnessed the wrath of the sun god? I want to play a short clip here. It's quite famous. Some of you may know about it. It's Robert Oppenheimer, one of the people who worked on the Manhattan Project to develop nuclear weapons.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
From there, I want to return to this image of the bow arising as a kind of natural consequence of the branch, and to unfold that onto the image of war. to, I think it's an idea that's espoused in literature that is almost deterministic, in that the weapon systems and the societal structures that we experience were in nature. And I think I will end with repeating the quote from the beginning. "It makes no difference what men think of war," said the judge. "War endures. As well ask men what they think of stone. War was always here. Before man was, war waited for him. The ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. That is the way it was and will be, that way and not some other way." Thank you.